My husband Richard left divorce papers on our kitchen counter for our 10th anniversary, thinking I'd beg and cry like the weak woman he believed I was. Instead, I called my ex-boyfriend Anthony, now the city's most ruthless divorce attorney, and by morning, Richard was served papers that made him realize he'd just handed his fortune to the woman he tried to destroy. But this story didn't start with that phone call. It didn't even start with finding those papers scattered across the marble countertop like confetti from hell.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
No, this story began 3 years earlier, in a house that felt more like a museum than a home, with a woman who had forgotten what her own voice sounded like. My name is Nell Larkin, and if you had met me 3 years ago, you would have seen exactly what Richard Donovan wanted you to see. The perfect wife, polished, quiet, grateful. I wore pearls to grocery stores, and hosted dinner parties where I never sat down to eat. I coordinated my nail polish to my handbags, and could discuss wine pairings with the kind of breathless enthusiasm that made other women roll their eyes behind their champagne flutes. I hadn't always been this version of myself. There was a time when I wore ripped jeans to art galleries, when I stayed up until 3 in the morning painting murals on my apartment walls, when I believed that love meant someone accepting your chaos, not organizing it into neat silent compartments. That woman died slowly, room by room, in Richard's colonial mansion in Westfield Heights. We met at a charity auction 7 years ago. I was 26, fresh from art school, volunteering to help set up the silent auction tables. Richard was 32, newly promoted to partner at his investment firm, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He bid on my donated painting, an abstract piece I'd titled Stormbreaking, not because he liked it, but because he liked the way I blushed when the auctioneer announced his winning bid. "You're talented," he said, afterward cornering me near the dessert table. "But talent without direction is just expensive hobby." I should have walked away then. Should have recognized the way he said expensive hobby like it was something shameful, something to be cured. Instead, I felt flattered that this successful handsome man in his perfect suit was paying attention to the girl with paint still under her fingernails. Our courtship was a masterclass in gradual transformation. He didn't ask me to stop painting. He just made sure I was too busy to pick up a brush. Gallery openings became networking events, where I was his lovely companion, not an artist in my own right. My studio apartment became too small for entertaining, so I moved into his pristine house, where there was no room designated for creative mess. "You could paint in the basement," he offered once. The same tone you'd use to suggest someone keep their hobbies in the garage with the Christmas decorations and broken lawn furniture. By the time we married 2 years later, I had convinced myself this was growth. Maturity. I was becoming the kind of woman who mattered, who belonged in rooms with crystal chandeliers and conversations about market volatility. The kind of woman Richard Donovan deserved. The wedding was everything I'd never wanted, and everything he'd always planned. 300 guests at the country club, a 7-course meal I was too nervous to eat, and a dress that cost more than my car. In our wedding photos, I'm smiling the smile I'd perfected by then, lips curved, eyes bright, the expression of a woman who has learned that happiness is a performance, not a feeling. My maid of honor was Patricia Clive, my college roommate who flew in from Seattle where she was running her own marketing firm. During the reception, she pulled me aside in the bathroom. "You look beautiful, Nell," she said, but her voice carried a question mark. "You look different." "Good different?" I asked, touching the pearl necklace Richard had given me as a wedding gift. Patricia studied my reflection in the ornate mirror. "You look like you're wearing a costume." I laughed it off, blamed the formal makeup, the elaborate hairstyle. But that night, lying in the honeymoon suite while Richard made phone calls to clients who couldn't wait until we returned, I stared at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw what Patricia had seen, a stranger wearing my face. The first 3 years of marriage passed like a movie playing at the wrong speed. Days blurred together in a routine that felt both suffocating and safe. I woke at 6 to make Richard's coffee exactly the way he liked it. 2 sugars, splash of cream, served in the blue ceramic mug his mother had given us. I planned meals around his schedule, social events around his business calendar. My entire existence around the gravitational pull of his needs. I told myself this was partnership. When he criticized the way I loaded the dishwasher, I learned his system. When he suggested I might look better as a blonde, I made an appointment with his hairstylist. When he mentioned that successful wives in his circle didn't work traditional jobs, I stopped applying for positions at galleries and museums. Instead, I became a professional wife. I organized his closets by season and color coordination. I memorized the names and personal details of all his colleagues' spouses. I could host a dinner party for 12 with 3 days' notice and make it look effortless. I learned to play tennis at the country club, not because I enjoyed it, but because the wives of successful men played tennis. My art supplies gathered dust in boxes in the basement, next to the Christmas decorations and Richard's old law school textbooks. Sometimes, late at night when he was working late or traveling, I would go down there and just hold a paintbrush, running my thumb over the bristles like a rosary. The woman I used to be felt like someone I'd known in childhood, fondly remembered but ultimately outgrown. I convinced myself this was what love looked like at 30. Compromise. Sacrifice. Building something together, even if that something looked more like Richard's vision than mine. My friends from art school gradually stopped calling. Not out of malice, but because I had become someone who responded to invitations to gallery openings with regrets and explanations about prior commitments. Someone who talked about household renovations instead of creative projects, who knew more about wine than I did about contemporary artists. But I was safe, comfortable. I had a beautiful home, financial security, and a husband who provided for me in the way I'd been told every woman should want. I wore the right clothes, said the right things, smiled at the right moments. I just forgot, somewhere along the way, that I was supposed to be happy. The cracks in our marriage were so hairline thin that I convinced myself they were just the natural settling of any long-term relationship. The way Richard corrected me in public, not cruelly, just small adjustments to make me more accurate, more appropriate. The way he'd taken over our social calendar entirely because I wasn't good with names and dates. The way he'd started making decisions about our home, our finances, our future without consulting me, because I'd proven myself not really a details person. I was disappearing by degrees, so gradually that I didn't notice until I was already gone. Looking back now, I can see that Richard knew exactly what he was doing from the very beginning. But at the time, his interest felt like sunlight after years of living in shadows. He made me feel chosen, special, like I was the missing piece in his perfectly orchestrated life. After that charity auction, he called the next morning. Not the next week, not after some calculated waiting period. The next morning, while I was still in my pajamas eating cereal from a chipped bowl in my tiny kitchen. "Nell, it's Richard Donovan, from last night." His voice was warm, confident. "I hope I'm not calling too early." It was 9 a.m. on a Saturday. For most people, this would be reasonable. For someone who'd spent Friday night at a black tie event, it suggested he'd been thinking about me enough to call as soon as it was socially acceptable. "I was wondering," he continued, "if you'd like to have dinner this week, somewhere we can actually hear each other talk." That first dinner was at Marconi's, the kind of restaurant where the maitre d' knew Richard by name, and the sommelier brought wine without being asked.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Richard pulled out my chair, ordered for both of us after asking what I liked, and spent 2 hours asking me questions about my art, my childhood, my dreams. He listened like I was the most fascinating person he'd ever met. When I told him about growing up in my grandmother's house, painting watercolors on her back porch while she gardened, he leaned forward like he was memorizing every detail. "You must miss that," he said. "The simplicity of it, creating just for the joy of creating." "I do," I admitted. "Sometimes I feel like I'm painting for galleries and critics now instead of for myself." "That's the price of success," he said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "But maybe there's a way to have both. Recognition and personal fulfillment." He made it sound possible, this balance I'd been struggling to find between paying rent and maintaining artistic integrity. Here was a man who understood both worlds, who could see the value in what I was trying to build. After dinner, he walked me to my car, an ancient Honda Civic that sputtered when I turned the key. He didn't comment on the paint peeling from the hood, or the way the engine coughed to life. Instead he said, "Drive safe. Text me when you get home." The care in his voice made something warm bloom in my chest. When was the last time someone had worried about my 10-minute drive home? Our second date was a picnic in Riverside Park. Richard arrived with a wicker basket that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread, cloth napkins, real glasses, sandwiches from the deli I'd mentioned, loving but could rarely afford. "I thought we could do something more relaxed," he said, spreading out a blanket under an oak tree. "Get to know each other without waiters interrupting every 5 minutes." We talked for hours. He told me about growing up as the youngest of 3 boys, how his father had built his investment firm from nothing and expected his sons to be worthy of the legacy. He talked about the pressure, the long hours, the way success sometimes felt like a prison made of other people's expectations. "I envy you," he said, watching me sketch the pond while we talked. The freedom to create something from nothing, to make beauty instead of just managing money. "It's not as romantic as it sounds," I laughed. "Last month I chose between buying paint and buying groceries. Paint won." "What if you didn't have to choose?" he asked quietly. I looked up from my sketch pad. "What do you mean? What if you had the security to create without worrying about rent? What if someone believed in your art enough to invest in your future as an artist?" The way he said it made my heart race. Not just the implied financial support, but the idea that someone saw my art as worthy of investment. My own parents, much as they loved me, had always treated my painting like a phase I'd eventually outgrow. "That sounds too good to be true," I said. "The best things usually do," Richard replied, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "That's why most people don't reach for them." By our 5th date, he was talking about our future with the confidence of someone who'd already decided I was worth his time long term. He spoke in when we instead of if we. "When we travel to Italy, you'll paint the vineyards. When we buy a house, you'll have a proper studio. When we host dinner parties, your art will be the first thing guests notice." He painted pictures with his words, futures where I was both supported and celebrated, where I could create without the constant anxiety about money, where my art would hang in our home instead of being stored in closets because I couldn't afford proper display space. "I've been thinking," he said over dinner at his favorite steakhouse, 6 weeks into our relationship. "You should meet my parents." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. Meeting parents was a declaration, a statement of serious intent. "They're having their annual summer party next weekend. Nothing formal, just close friends and family. I'd like you to be there." The way he said it made it clear this wasn't really a request. It was an invitation into his world, an opportunity to prove I could fit into the life he was offering. "What should I wear?" I asked, already mentally calculating whether I could afford something appropriate. Don't worry about that, he said, pulling out his phone. I'll have my assistant send you some options. She has excellent taste and she knows what works for these events. The ease with which he solved problems that had been keeping me awake at night was intoxicating. When I mentioned my car making strange noises, he scheduled a maintenance appointment with his mechanic. When I worried about my portfolio presentation for a gallery, he hired a professional photographer to reshoot my work properly. Let me take care of these things, he'd say whenever I protested. You should be focusing on your art, not worrying about details. It felt like love, this desire to smooth all the rough edges from my life. Like partnership, the way he anticipated my needs and solved problems before I even had to ask. His parents' party was everything I'd expected, and everything I'd feared. The house in Beacon Hill was the kind of old money estate that appeared in architectural magazines, with gardens that required a full-time staff and rooms that looked like they'd been furnished by someone who'd never worried about a price tag. Richard's mother, Elizabeth Donovan, greeted me with the kind of smile that managed to be both warm and evaluative. "So you're the artist Richard's been telling us about," she said, leading me through rooms filled with people who looked like they'd stepped out of a country club catalog. "How lovely. We need more creativity in this family." She said it like creativity was an exotic spice she was adding to an otherwise traditional recipe. The evening was a careful dance of introductions and conversations where I felt simultaneously included and observed. Richard stayed close, his hand on my back, guiding me through social interactions like a proud host showing off his newest acquisition. "Nell's incredibly talented," he told his father's business partner while I stood beside him smiling. "She's been showing in galleries around the city. Very promising career ahead of her." The way he spoke about my art made it sound more successful than it actually was, but also somehow diminished, like it was a charming trait, rather than my life's passion. When someone asked about my latest show, Richard answered before I could speak. "She's taking a brief hiatus to focus on developing her style," he said smoothly. "Sometimes artists need to step back and reassess before the next phase of their career." I hadn't told him I was taking a hiatus. I'd mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the pressure to produce saleable work, but that wasn't the same thing. Still, the way he presented it made me sound thoughtful and strategic rather than struggling and uncertain. By the end of the evening, I felt like I'd passed some kind of test I didn't know I was taking. Richard's parents had been gracious, his friends welcoming, and everyone seemed to approve of his choice in me. "You were perfect tonight," he said on the drive home, his hand resting on my knee. "My mother loved you. She said you have exactly the kind of grace this family needs." Grace. I'd never thought of myself in those terms, but coming from Richard's world, it felt like the highest compliment. I was learning to be graceful, learning to fit into spaces that required a softer version of myself. That night, lying in Richard's king-sized bed in his pristine apartment, I felt like Cinderella after the ball. Everything about this new life felt magical, impossible, like I might wake up and find myself back in my cramped studio apartment with its leaky faucet and neighbors who played music too loud. But I didn't wake up from the dream. Instead, I sank deeper into it, letting Richard's vision of our future become the blueprint for the woman I was slowly becoming. The first crack in the fairy tale appeared 3 months into our relationship, so small I almost missed it entirely. We were at my apartment, a rare occurrence since Richard preferred his place with its updated kitchen and reliable heating, and I was showing him some new paintings I'd been working on. Watercolor abstracts, inspired by the changing season, all blues and grays, with hints of gold breaking through like sunlight after a storm. "These are interesting," Richard said, studying them with the same expression he wore when reviewing financial reports. "Very emotional." "That was the idea," I said, pleased that he'd noticed. I'd been experimenting with letting feeling drive the composition instead of planning everything out. He nodded slowly, hands clasped behind his back. They're quite different from your earlier work. More chaotic. The word hit me like cold water. Chaotic. Not in a bad way, he said quickly, moving to put his arm around me. Just less refined, more raw. I suppose that's what you're going for. I thought they showed growth, I said, looking at the paintings with fresh eyes. Were they chaotic? They felt alive to me, spontaneous, but maybe that wasn't the same thing. Growth, yes, but perhaps growth, in a different direction, might be more marketable. He gestured toward my earlier pieces, the ones that had caught his attention at the charity auction. These have such elegance, such control. Gallery owners appreciate that kind of sophistication. I stared at the watercolors, trying to see them through his eyes. The spontaneity I'd been proud of suddenly looked like lack of discipline. The emotional honesty felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made me want to cover them up. You really think they're too chaotic? I asked. I think you're capable of much more sophisticated work, he said diplomatically. Maybe we could arrange for you to take some advanced classes. Refine your technique. I know a few people in the art world who could give you guidance. The offer was generous, supportive even. So why did it feel like criticism wrapped in silk? That night, I put the watercolors away in a drawer, and pulled out my older work. The pieces Richard admired were undeniably skillful, carefully composed, each brushstroke deliberate and controlled. Safe, predictable. Everything my grandmother had taught me not to be when I was 8 years old, mixing colors on her back porch. Art should surprise you, Nell, she used to say. If you know exactly what you're going to paint before you start, you're not creating, you're just copying yourself. But Richard's world valued expertise over experimentation, polish over passion, and I wanted to belong in his world more than I wanted to defend my messy watercolors. The pattern established itself slowly, so gradually I didn't recognize it as a pattern at all. Small suggestions that felt like loving guidance. Gentle corrections that seemed designed to help me succeed. When I mentioned wanting to apply for a group show at a gallery downtown, Richard frowned. Isn't that the place that shows mostly student work? You're beyond that level now, Nell. You should be aiming higher. When I wore a vintage dress to one of his work functions, he complimented it but added, "You have such classic beauty. You could really make an impact in something more contemporary, more sophisticated." When I talked about taking a weekend trip to Vermont to paint fall landscapes, he worried about the timing. We have the Morrison dinner party that Saturday. Remember? And Sunday I thought we could look at houses in Westfield Heights. I found a few properties with perfect studio spaces. Each suggestion made sense individually. The gallery was known for emerging artists, and maybe I was ready for something more established. The vintage dress was lovely, but perhaps not quite right for his corporate world. Vermont would be there next year, and house hunting was practical, important for our future together. But somehow, piece by piece, my preferences kept getting replaced by better versions. Improved versions. Versions that fit more seamlessly into the life Richard was building for us. The house hunting was when I first felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. Richard had been researching properties for weeks, making appointments with realtors, studying market trends and neighborhood demographics. When he picked me up that Sunday morning, he had a folder full of listings, all carefully highlighted and annotated. "I've narrowed it down to the top 5, he said, handing me the folder as we drove toward Westfield Heights. "All have excellent studio potential, and they're in the right price range for appreciation." I flipped through the listings, each one more impressive than the last. Tudor revivals with manicured lawns, colonials with chef's kitchens, contemporary builds with walls of windows. They were beautiful, aspirational, the kind of homes I'd admired in magazines, but never imagined living in. They were also nothing like what I'd pictured when I dreamed about having a home with someone I loved. These are all pretty formal, I said carefully. I was thinking maybe something with more character, older, maybe something we could fix up together. Richard glanced at me with surprise. Why would we want a project house when we can afford something move-in ready? These properties are investments, Nell. They'll hold their value. I know, it's just, I always imagined having a house with history. Maybe a Victorian with original details, or a farmhouse with lots of land. Somewhere I could have a real garden. Victorians are money pits, Richard said practically. Beautiful, but the maintenance costs are astronomical. And farmhouses are too isolated. We need to think about resale value, proximity to my office, the quality of the school district. School district? I asked. We'd never talked about children, not seriously. For the future, he said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. We want to be prepared. The first house was a colonial in Westfield Heights' most prestigious neighborhood. The realtor, a woman named Janet who clearly knew Richard well, led us through rooms that looked like they'd been staged for a photo shoot. Everything was neutral, tasteful, expensive. The master suite has been completely renovated, Janet explained, showing us a bedroom with a sitting area and a bathroom the size of my entire apartment. And wait until you see the kitchen. The kitchen was stunning, marble countertops, professional-grade appliances, an island that could seat 6 people. It was the kind of kitchen that appeared in cooking magazines, designed for entertaining rather than the messy joy of everyday meal preparation. What do you think? Richard asked, watching my face carefully. It's beautiful, I said because it was. Very sophisticated. The previous owners were entertainers, Janet added. This kitchen has hosted some wonderful dinner parties. I tried to imagine myself in this space, chopping vegetables on the pristine marble, hosting the kind of dinner parties Richard's parents threw. It felt like playing dress-up in someone else's life. And the basement has been finished, Janet continued, leading us downstairs. Perfect for a home office or hobby room. The basement was carpeted in beige, with fluorescent lighting and no windows. Janet gestured enthusiastically at the space, like she was revealing a treasure. This could be your studio, Richard said, turning to me with excitement. Plenty of room for all your supplies, and it's separated from the main living areas, so you won't have to worry about mess or paint fumes. I stood in the windowless room, trying to imagine spending hours here creating art. No natural light, no connection to the outside world, hidden away from the rest of the house, like my painting was something that needed to be contained. It's very private, I managed. Exactly, Richard said, missing the hesitation in my voice. You could work for hours without any distractions. We saw 3 more houses that day, each one variations on the same theme: beautiful, expensive, appropriate for a successful investment banker and his wife. By the 4th house, I stopped asking about studio spaces. Richard had already decided the basement or spare bedroom would be perfect, and my questions about natural light or ventilation seemed to irritate him. You're being very picky, he said, as we drove to the final property. These are all excellent houses in the best neighborhood. Most artists would kill for dedicated studio space like this. I know, I said quickly. I'm sorry, they're all wonderful. I just want to make sure we find the right fit. The right fit is a house that will appreciate in value and provide the kind of lifestyle we want to build together, Richard said, his tone patient but firm. Personal preferences are secondary to practical considerations. That evening, back at his apartment, Richard spread the listings across his dining table and pulled out a legal pad to make a pros and cons list for each property. His approach was methodical, analytical, based on market data and long-term financial projections. The Colonial on Elm Street is the clear winner, he concluded, circling the listing with a red pen. Best value, lowest maintenance costs, highest potential appreciation. We should make an offer this week. I looked at the photo of the house, symmetrical, pristine, indistinguishable from a dozen others on the same street. It would be a wonderful home for someone, but that someone didn't feel like me. Don't you want to see a few more options? I asked. Maybe in different neighborhoods. Richard looked up from his calculations, genuinely puzzled. Why would we want to look at inferior properties when we've found the perfect house? Sometimes, Nell, you have to trust that I know what's best for our future. I've been doing this longer than you have. The dismissal was gentle but absolute. I was being emotional, impractical, naive about real estate markets and investment strategies. Richard was the expert, the one with experience in making major financial decisions. I should be grateful he was willing to guide me through this process. That night, lying in his bed while he reviewed mortgage documents, I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand why I felt so empty. We were about to buy a beautiful house in the best neighborhood in the city. I was dating a man who loved me enough to share his sophisticated world with me, who wanted to provide me with everything I could possibly need. So why did I feel like I was disappearing? The Colonial on Elm Street became our home 6 months later, and with it came the final transformation of Nell Larkin into Mrs. Richard Donovan. The woman who had once spent Saturday afternoons wandering through flea markets looking for vintage frames and unusual trinkets was replaced by someone who scheduled weekly appointments with an interior designer. We want the house to reflect our lifestyle, Richard explained to Monica, the decorator he'd hired without consulting me. Sophisticated but comfortable. Classic with contemporary touches. I sat in our new living room. Our living room, though nothing in it reflected my taste, and watched Monica take notes about color palettes and furniture placement. She spoke about the house like it was a stage set, each room designed to create a specific impression on visitors. The entry should say successes immediately, Monica said, sketching layouts in her leather portfolio. We'll do a console table here, maybe an orchid arrangement, something that signals taste and attention to detail. What about some of Nell's paintings? Richard suggested, glancing at me with what looked like generosity. She's quite talented. It might be nice to display some of her work. Monica's smile was polite but practiced. Of course, we could certainly incorporate some personal artwork. Maybe in the powder room or the hallway leading to the kitchen, somewhere more intimate. Not the living room, where guests would see them first. Not the dining room, where they might start conversations. Somewhere intimate, meaning somewhere that wouldn't interfere with the overall aesthetic Monica was creating. That sounds perfect, I said, because I'd learned that agreeing was easier than explaining why it felt like my art was being relegated to the same category as family photos and children's drawings. The basement studio Richard had been so excited about became exactly what I'd feared, a windowless room where I went to pretend I was still an artist. I'd painted exactly 3 canvases in the 6 months since we'd moved in, each one feeling more forced than the last. Without natural light, without any connection to the world outside, my work felt as confined as I did. Richard noticed my decreased productivity. Of course, he noticed everything. Maybe you're experiencing a creative block, he suggested one evening, finding me staring at a blank canvas in the basement. It happens to all artists. Perhaps some time away from painting would help. Let your subconscious process. Time away from painting turned into joining the country club, where I learned to play tennis and made conversation with other wives about vacation destinations and charity fundraisers. It meant volunteering for the hospital auxiliary, organizing events I had no passion for with women who spoke in the kind of measured, careful tones I was beginning to recognize in my own voice. Nell's becoming quite the social coordinator, Richard would tell people at dinner parties. She organized the entire autumn gala for the children's hospital, raised more money than they'd seen in years. He was proud of me, genuinely proud. I could see it in the way he introduced me to his colleagues, the way he squeezed my hand when people complimented the events I organized or the way I managed our home. I was becoming the kind of wife who reflected well on her husband's success, who enhanced his reputation rather than complicating it. But late at night, when Richard was asleep beside me in our king-sized bed with its expensive sheets and decorator pillows, I would lie awake and try to remember what I used to dream about. Before Richard, before the house, before I learned to measure my worth by how seamlessly I fit into his world. The dreams, when I could remember them, were always the same. I was in my grandmother's garden, painting watercolors while she worked among her flowers. The light was golden, the air smelled like roses and fresh earth, and every brushstroke felt like coming home to myself. I'd wake up from these dreams with tears on my face, though I couldn't explain why. "You've been having nightmares," Richard observed one morning, studying my face over his coffee cup. "You were restless last night, talking in your sleep." What was I saying? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Something about wanting to go home. He set down his cup with the kind of precision that suggested my sleep-talking had bothered him more than he was letting on. "You are home, Nell. This is our home." "I know," I said quickly. "I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that. But I did know. The house on Elm Street was beautiful, expensive, everything I should have wanted. It just didn't feel like mine. None of it felt like mine, not the furniture Monica had selected, not the social calendar Richard managed, not the woman I saw in the mirror each morning." Patricia visited that fall, her first time seeing our new house. I gave her the full tour, pointing out the features I'd learned to highlight: the marble countertops, the walk-in closets, the finished basement that served as my studio. "It's stunning, Nell," she said, though something in her voice sounded careful. "Very polished." We sat in the living room with glasses of wine, surrounded by Monica's perfectly coordinated color scheme. Patricia looked around like she was trying to find something familiar, some trace of the friend she'd known in college. "Where are your paintings?" she asked finally. "The ones from your apartment, the series you were working on when I visited last year." "Oh, those." I waved my hand dismissively, the way I'd learned to do when people asked about my art. "I'm working on new pieces now, more sophisticated work." "Can I see them?" I led her down to the basement, turning on the fluorescent lights that made everything look flat and institutional. My 3 completed paintings sat on easels, looking smaller and less significant in the windowless space. Patricia studied them quietly, her expression unreadable. They were technically proficient, carefully composed, completely devoid of the emotional honesty that had once characterized my work. "They're very controlled," she said finally. "Richard says that's what galleries are looking for now. More refinement, less chaos." Patricia turned to look at me directly, and I saw something in her eyes that made me want to look away. Concern. Pity, maybe. "Nell, can I ask you something? Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. Happy? I had everything I was supposed to want: a beautiful home, financial security, a husband who provided for me and included me in his successful world. Of course I was happy. "Yes," I said, automatically. "Of course I'm happy." "Why would you ask that? You just seem different, quieter, like you're holding something back." "I'm not holding anything back. I'm just more mature now, more focused on building a life with Richard instead of chasing impractical dreams." Even as I said it, the words felt foreign in my mouth. "I'm practical dreams." When had I started thinking about my art that way? Patricia nodded, but she didn't look convinced. "I'm glad you're happy," she said. I just missed the Nell, who used to paint at 3 in the morning because she couldn't sleep until she got an image out of her head. After she left, I stood in my basement studio and tried to remember the last time I'd felt compelled to paint something, anything, in the middle of the night. The last time I'd been so excited about an idea that I couldn't wait until morning to explore it. I couldn't remember. That night at dinner, Richard asked about Patricia's visit. She seemed nice enough, he said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. A bit intense though, very career-focused. She's doing well, I said. Her firm is expanding to Portland. That's the problem with women in business, Richard continued, apparently not noticing that he was talking to a woman. They get so focused on proving themselves that they forget what really matters: family, partnership, building something meaningful with someone you love. He reached across the table to squeeze my hand, and I smiled the smile I'd perfected over the past year, grateful, content, completely in agreement with whatever wisdom he was sharing. I'm lucky I found someone who understands what really matters, he added. I'm the lucky one, I replied, because that's what wives said in moments like this. But lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Richard slept peacefully beside me, I wondered when lucky had started feeling so much like lost. The woman Patricia had known. The one who painted at 3 in the morning, who wore vintage dresses to gallery openings, who believed art should surprise you. She was disappearing so gradually that even I hadn't noticed until someone else went looking for her. And the most terrifying part was that I wasn't sure I knew how to find her again, even if I wanted to. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in March, exactly 3 years after we'd moved into the house on Elm Street. It should have been an ordinary day. Richard at the office, me organizing the final details for the spring charity luncheon I was hosting for the hospital auxiliary. Instead, it became the day I finally saw my marriage clearly for what it had become. I was in Richard's home office, looking for the guest list I'd printed the day before, when I knocked over a stack of papers on his desk. As I bent to collect them, a familiar image caught my eye, one of my old paintings from before we'd met. The watercolor abstract I'd called Storm Breaking, the one Richard had bid on at the charity auction where we first met. But it wasn't hanging somewhere in our house, as I'd assumed all these years. It was in a manila folder marked Storage Unit #47 Misc items. My hands trembled as I rifled through the folder. Inside were photographs and insurance documentation for dozens of items Richard had put in storage. My grandmother's rocking chair, the vintage dresser I'd inherited from my aunt, my easel, canvases I'd painted in college, even the chipped ceramic bowl I used to eat cereal from in my old apartment. Everything that had made my old life feel like home, hidden away in a storage unit like embarrassing evidence of who I used to be. At the bottom of the folder was a handwritten note in Richard's precise script. Nell's old things, dispose of after 5 years if not claimed. The date was from 6 months ago. The 5-year mark had already passed. I sat in his leather desk chair, staring at the inventory list, and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not just my heart, my entire sense of reality. For 3 years, I'd believed we were building a life together. But Richard had been systematically erasing my past while I wasn't looking, keeping only the parts of me that fit his vision of who I should become. The front door opened, and I heard Richard's footsteps in the foyer. He was home early, which never happened unless he needed something. "Nell, are you here?" His voice carried that particular tone he used when he expected immediate attention. I quickly stuffed the papers back into the folder, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped half of them on the floor. By the time Richard appeared in the doorway of his office, I was on my knees, frantically trying to organize the scattered documents. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his voice sharp with irritation. "I was looking for the guest list," I said, not meeting his eyes. I knocked over some papers by accident. Richard's gaze moved from me to the folder in my hands, and I watched his expression shift from annoyance to something harder to read. Recognition, calculation. You found the storage unit inventory, he said matter-of-factly, like we were discussing grocery lists. I stood slowly, still holding the folder. You put all my things in storage, without telling me. They were cluttering up the house, Richard said, loosening his tie as he moved to stand behind his desk. You hadn't used any of it in years. I assumed you'd moved beyond that phase of your life. That phase of my life. My voice came out smaller than I intended. Those were my grandmother's things. My art supplies. Paintings I'd worked on for months. Nell, look around. Richard gestured toward the perfectly appointed office, then toward the doorway that led to our perfectly appointed house. Look at what we've built together. Why would you want to fill our home with reminders of when you were struggling? When you were, he paused, searching for the right word. Less than who you are now. Less than who I am now. I repeated. You were living in a studio apartment, eating cereal for dinner, worried about rent every month. You had talent, but no direction. No stability. I helped you become someone worthy of this life. The words hit me like physical blows. Worthy. As if the woman I'd been before meeting him had been somehow inadequate, something to be improved upon and ultimately discarded. I never asked you to put my things in storage, I said, my voice getting stronger. Those weren't your decisions to make. Richard's jaw tightened in the way it did, when he was losing patience with what he considered unreasonable behavior. I made practical decisions about space management in our home. If you'd wanted those items, you would have mentioned them at some point in the past 3 years. I thought they were safe. I thought they were somewhere in the house, maybe in the attic or... The attic is climate-controlled storage, for important documents and seasonal items. Richard interrupted. Not a warehouse for sentimental clutter. Sentimental clutter. My grandmother's rocking chair, where she'd held me while I was sick. The easel where I'd painted my first real piece of art. The ceramic bowl that had been a gift from Patricia when we graduated college together. You were going to throw them away, I said, looking down at the note in the folder. Without even asking me. The storage unit costs money every month, Nell. Money we could be using for things that actually matter to our future together. I stared at him, this man I'd been married to for 3 years, and realized I was looking at a stranger. Or maybe I was finally seeing him clearly for the first time. When were you planning to tell me? I asked. Tell you what? That you'd decided my past wasn't worth keeping. That the woman I was before you wasn't worth preserving. Richard sighed. The sound he made when he was preparing to explain something to someone who wasn't quite intelligent enough to understand it on their own. Nell, we've talked about this. Growth requires letting go of things that no longer serve you. You're not that struggling artist anymore. You're my wife. You're a respected member of this community. You organize charity events that raise thousands of dollars. You're accomplished, sophisticated, valued. I was valued before I met you too, I said quietly. By whom? The question came out sharper than he'd probably intended. A handful of people who bought your paintings at coffee shops. Gallery owners who gave you wall space because they felt sorry for you. That's not the same as being genuinely valued by people who matter. The room went silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock on Richard's bookshelf. I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and saw someone who had never valued the woman he'd married. He'd seen potential in me, raw material that could be shaped into something more suitable for his purposes. But he had never valued me. The woman you fell in love with, I said slowly. She painted those pictures you put in storage. She lived in that apartment, ate cereal from that bowl, sat in that rocking chair. If she wasn't worthy of keeping, then what exactly did you fall in love with? Richard's expression softened slightly, the way it did when he was preparing to be magnanimous. I fell in love with who you could become. And look, I was right. You became everything I saw in you. But that was the problem, wasn't it? He'd never fallen in love with me at all. He'd fallen in love with his vision of who I could be if I just stopped being myself. I set the folder down on his desk and walked toward the door. Where are you going? Richard called after me. To get my things, I said, without turning around. From storage. Nell, don't be dramatic. We can discuss this like adults. I paused in the doorway and looked back at him. Adults discuss things before they make decisions that affect their spouse's life. Adults don't hide their wife's belongings in storage units and plan to throw them away without permission. For the first time in our conversation, Richard looked uncertain. I was protecting you from dwelling on the past, helping you move forward. You were erasing me, I said, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the version of me you preferred. I left him standing in his office and drove to the storage facility on the other side of town. When I opened Unit #47, I found everything exactly as Richard had documented. My grandmother's furniture covered in dust, my canvases stacked against the walls, my art supplies packed in boxes like archaeological artifacts from a life I'd been forced to forget. I sat in my grandmother's rocking chair, surrounded by the remnants of who I used to be, and cried for the first time in years. Not the careful, silent tears I'd learned to shed in our perfect house, but the messy, honest sobs of someone finally mourning what she'd lost. And in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of who I'd been before Richard decided to improve me, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to remember how to be myself again, even if it meant losing everything else. That night, I sat in our marble bathroom, staring at my reflection in the vanity mirror. Richard had chosen because it had the most flattering lighting. The woman looking back at me was perfectly put together, hair styled in the sophisticated bob his hairdresser had recommended, skin glowing from the expensive facial treatments I got monthly, wearing the silk pajamas he'd bought me because cotton was too casual for a woman of my position. But behind the polished exterior, I could see something I hadn't noticed in years. Anger. Real honest anger burning in my eyes like the first spark of a fire that had been smothered too long. I pulled open the vanity drawer and found my old sketchbook, the one I'd hidden behind spare towels 6 months ago during one of my midnight moments of missing who I used to be. The pages were filled with fragments, half-finished drawings I'd started and abandoned. When I heard Richard's car in the driveway, quick sketches I'd made while he was on business calls, desperate attempts to remember what it felt like to create something that came from inside me instead of from his expectations. One sketch caught my attention. A woman with her back turned, walking away from a house that looked suspiciously like ours. I'd drawn it 3 months ago after another dinner party, where I'd spent the entire evening discussing renovation projects and vacation destinations, while my soul screamed for something real to talk about. I hadn't realized it then, but I'd been planning my escape without even knowing it. The house was quiet except for Richard's steady breathing from the bedroom. He'd gone to sleep easily after our confrontation, probably confident that I'd come to my senses by morning and apologize for being dramatic. That's what always happened. I got upset. He remained calm and rational, and eventually I convinced myself I was overreacting. But something was different this time. The discovery of the storage unit hadn't just hurt me, it had clarified something I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Richard didn't see me as a partner to cherish and protect. He saw me as a project to manage and improve. And the most terrifying part was how willingly I'd participated in my own erasure. I thought about Patricia's question from her visit. "Are you happy?" I'd answered automatically, defensively, the way I'd been trained to respond to any suggestion that my life wasn't perfect. But sitting there in the bathroom at 2 in the morning, surrounded by the luxury that was supposed to represent my success as a wife, I could finally answer honestly. No, I wasn't happy. I wasn't even really alive. I was existing in a beautiful cage, performing the role of the perfect wife for an audience of one man who had never wanted the real me in the first place. And the most devastating part was that I'd helped him build the cage, bar by bar, convinced that each restriction was protection, each limitation was love. But I could change that. The realization hit me like cold water. I could choose differently. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I hadn't called in over 2 years. My finger hovered over Anthony McIntosh's name, and for a moment I almost lost my nerve. Anthony and I had dated briefly in college, before he'd thrown himself completely into law school with the kind of single-minded determination that made relationships impossible. We'd broken up amicably, he'd been honest about his priorities, and I'd respected his ambition even as it meant losing him. He'd become one of the city's most successful divorce attorneys, the kind of lawyer wealthy people hired when they wanted to win at any cost. I'd seen his name in the society pages occasionally, always photographed at charity events or legal conferences, never with the same woman twice, still married to his work, apparently, but we'd parted on good terms. He'd even sent me a congratulations card when Richard and I got engaged, along with a note that said he hoped I'd found someone who could give me the attention I deserved. At the time, I'd thought it was a lovely sentiment. Now I wondered if he'd seen something I'd missed. Before I could second-guess myself, I typed out a message. Anthony, it's Nell Larkin. I know it's been a long time, but I could use some legal advice. Are you still practicing family law? I sent it before I could change my mind, then sat staring at the phone screen, my heart racing. What was I doing? Was I really considering leaving Richard? The man who'd given me everything: security, status, a beautiful home, a respectable place in society. The man who'd put my grandmother's rocking chair in storage, and planned to throw it away without telling me. My phone buzzed with a response faster than I'd expected. Nell, of course I remember you. Yes, I handle divorce cases. Are you okay? Can you talk? I glanced toward the bedroom where Richard was sleeping peacefully, probably dreaming about quarterly reports or golf scores. Then I typed back, can we meet tomorrow? I need to understand my options. Absolutely. My office at 2 p.m. And Nell, if you're reaching out to a divorce attorney at 2 a.m., you're probably past the point of needing to understand your options. You probably need to start planning your exit strategy. The bluntness of his response should have scared me. Instead, it felt like someone had finally given me permission to acknowledge what I'd been thinking, but hadn't dared to say out loud. I was planning my exit strategy. The next morning, Richard acted as if nothing had happened. He kissed my forehead before leaving for work, reminded me about the dinner reservation he'd made for our anniversary next week, and mentioned that he'd arranged for someone to clean out the storage unit, since I'd seemed so upset about it. I thought it would be easier if you didn't have to deal with all that old stuff yourself, he said, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror. The charity pickup is scheduled for Thursday. He was going to donate my grandmother's furniture, my paintings, the remnants of my former life to charity. Without asking. Again, I'd prefer to go through everything myself, I said carefully. Some of those items have sentimental value. Richard paused in his tie adjusting, meeting my eyes in the mirror. Nell, we discussed this yesterday. Dwelling on the past isn't healthy. It's time to let go. They're my things, Richard. I should be the one to decide what happens to them. His reflection frowned slightly. I'm trying to help you, Nell. Sometimes we need other people to help us make difficult decisions. That's what marriage is, partnership, trust, but trust was supposed to work both ways, wasn't it? And partners were supposed to consult each other before making decisions that affected their spouse's life. I'm going to the storage unit today, I said, meeting his gaze steadily in the mirror. I'll decide what to keep and what to donate. For a moment Richard's mask slipped, and I saw something I'd never noticed before: irritation at being challenged. Not disappointment or concern for my well-being, but genuine annoyance that I wasn't falling in line with his plans. "Fine," he said, his tone suggesting it was anything but fine. "Do whatever you think is best, but don't expect me to help you carry boxes of junk back into our home." Our home, as if it had ever really been mine. After he left, I sat in our pristine kitchen with my coffee, looking around at the life I'd built, or rather the life that had been built around me. Every detail was perfect, expensive, chosen by someone else. I couldn't find a single thing in the room that reflected my actual taste or personality. But that was about to change. At exactly 2 p.m., I was sitting in Anthony McIntosh's law office, wearing the most conservative outfit I owned, and feeling like I was about to step off a cliff. "So," Anthony said, settling back in his chair with the same direct manner I remembered from college. "Tell me what's happening, Nell. And don't leave anything out." Looking at Anthony across his mahogany desk, I was struck by how little he'd changed. The same sharp intelligence in his dark eyes, the same way of listening that made you feel like every word mattered. His success was evident in the corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the expensive suit that fit him perfectly, the confident way he carried himself. But there was something else, a warmth that I'd forgotten, a sense that he genuinely cared about the people sitting across from him. "I think my husband has been systematically controlling my life," I said, the words feeling strange and frightening to say out loud. "And I think I need to divorce him." Anthony nodded, pulling out a legal pad. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." So I did. I told him about the charity auction, about Richard's charm and generosity in those early days. I told him about the gradual changes, the suggestions that became expectations, the way my preferences were replaced by better options, the slow disappearance of everything that made me feel like myself. "He put my belongings in storage without telling me," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "My grandmother's furniture, my paintings, everything from my life before him. He was planning to throw it all away." Anthony wrote steadily, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "When did you sign the prenup?" I blinked. "We don't have a prenup." Anthony's pen stopped moving. "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure. Richard mentioned it once, early in our engagement, but we never actually signed anything formal." "That's unusual for someone in his financial position," Anthony said carefully. "Most investment bankers at his level insist on prenuptial agreements, especially when there's a significant income disparity." "Maybe he didn't think I was a financial threat," I said bitterly. "I had no assets, no inheritance, no career prospects that concerned him." Anthony made a note. "Actually, that might work in your favor. Without a prenup, you're entitled to half of everything acquired during the marriage. The house, his investment accounts, retirement funds, everything." I stared at him. "Half. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state. The court assumes that marriage is a partnership, and that both spouses contributed to the marital assets, regardless of who earned the money." He looked up from his notes. "Nell, your husband is worth approximately how much?" "I don't know exactly. He handles all our finances. I have access to a household account for expenses, but he manages everything else." Anthony frowned. "You don't know your household net worth." The question made me realize how completely I'd been excluded from our financial life. He said it was easier if he handled the complicated stuff. I trusted him. We'll need to do some investigation, Anthony said, making more notes. Bank records, investment accounts, property assessments. Do you have access to his computer or files? He keeps everything in his home office. It's always locked when he's not there. What about tax returns, joint bank statements, anything that comes in the mail? I thought about our pristine house, how Richard collected the mail every day before I even knew it had arrived. He handles all of that. Says it's too boring for me to worry about. Anthony set down his pen and looked at me directly. Now, I need you to understand something. Financial control is a form of abuse, keeping you ignorant of your own household's finances, making you dependent on an allowance while he controls significant assets. That's not normal marriage behavior. The word abuse hit me like a slap. But he never hurt me, never raised his voice, never. Abuse doesn't have to be physical, Anthony said gently. Emotional manipulation, financial control, systematic isolation from your support systems. These are all forms of abuse, and from what you're telling me, Richard has been very methodical about it. I sat quietly, processing this. Was I really an abuse victim? It seemed impossible. I lived in a beautiful house, wore expensive clothes, had everything I could possibly need. I need you to start documenting everything, Anthony continued. Every conversation, every decision he makes without consulting you, every time he dismisses your concerns, or makes you feel like you're overreacting. Can you do that? How? Keep a journal, note dates, times, what was said. If he sends emails or texts that demonstrate controlling behavior, forward them to a private account he doesn't know about. Take photos of important documents if you can access them safely. Anthony leaned forward. But most importantly, we need to understand what you're dealing with financially. I'm going to hire a forensic accountant to investigate your husband's assets. Bank records, investment portfolios, business interests, everything. Is that legal? In a divorce proceeding, yes. Both parties are entitled to full financial disclosure. We're just getting a head start. He paused. There's something else now. You mentioned Richard works for an investment firm. Do you know if he has any business partnerships? Side investments? Anything beyond his salary? I tried to remember conversations about his work, but realized most of them were one-sided. Richard talking about deals and clients, while I listened and asked appropriate questions. He mentioned something about a private equity group once. Some kind of investment opportunity with his colleagues. Anthony's expression sharpened. Do you remember any names? Company names? Partner names? Anything specific? James something. James Clive. Maybe. He comes to our dinner parties sometimes with his wife Anna. James Clive. Anthony repeated, writing it down. I know that name. He's involved in several high-end investment ventures around the city. He looked up at me. This could be significant now. If Richard has undisclosed business interests or investments, that changes the financial picture considerably. What do you mean? I mean your half could be worth a lot more than either of us initially thought. For the next hour, Anthony walked me through the divorce process, the timeline, the likely outcomes, what to expect from Richard when he realized I was serious about leaving. He gave me a secure phone number where I could reach him anytime, set up a private email account for our communications, and explained the steps I needed to take to protect myself. The most important thing right now is information, he said, as our meeting wrapped up. Learn everything you can about your financial situation. Be careful, but be thorough. And now, he stood up and came around the desk. Don't let him convince you that you're being unreasonable or dramatic. Trust your instincts. They brought you here for a reason. As I left his office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the passive hope of wishing things would get better, but the active hope of someone who was finally taking control of her own life. I drove to the storage unit and spent the afternoon going through my belongings, carefully photographing everything before packing the most important items into my car. My grandmother's jewelry box, filled with pieces I'd forgotten I owned. Photo albums from college, including pictures of Anthony and me at various events, young, happy, full of possibilities. And tucked inside one of my old art portfolios, I found something that made my heart race, a letter from a gallery owner in Boston, dated 2 months before I met Richard. She was offering me a solo show, praising my raw emotional honesty and unique perspective. I'd never seen the letter before. It was addressed to my old apartment, forwarded to the house on Elm Street. Richard must have intercepted it, hidden it away with everything else he'd decided wasn't important to my future. I sat in my car in the storage facility parking lot, holding the letter with shaking hands. A solo show. Recognition of my work as significant, valuable, worth celebrating. The artistic future I'd been told was impractical, unrealistic, not worth pursuing. That night, I began my journal. On the first page I wrote, Day 1, I found out who I used to be. Tomorrow I start finding out who I'm going to become. But first, I had a marriage to investigate. 3 weeks into my secret investigation, I found the key that would unlock everything. Richard's laptop, left open on the kitchen counter while he took a shower before our anniversary dinner. I'd been methodically documenting our life together, photographing bank statements when Richard left them out, noting conversations where he dismissed my concerns, or made financial decisions without consulting me. Anthony's forensic accountant had already uncovered several interesting discrepancies: business accounts Richard had never mentioned, investment properties I didn't know we owned, a trust fund from his family that somehow never came up in our discussions about money. But I still didn't have the full picture. Richard was careful, methodical in his privacy. His home office remained locked, his important papers filed away in cabinets I'd never been given access to. I was gathering pieces of a puzzle without seeing the complete image. Until that Tuesday evening, when his phone rang while he was reviewing something on his laptop at the kitchen island. I need to take this, he said, glancing at the caller ID. It's the Singapore office. This might take a while. He disappeared upstairs, leaving his laptop open to an email thread that made my blood freeze. The subject line read, Anniversary Surprise Final Arrangements. But it wasn't about dinner reservations or romantic getaways. It was about divorce papers. With shaking hands, I scrolled through the email chain between Richard and his attorney David Larkin. The timestamp showed they'd been planning this for months. Richard, as discussed, I'll have the papers ready for service on your anniversary. The timing is strategic. Most judges are sympathetic to husbands who've endured difficult marriages, and serving her on such a significant date reinforces the narrative that she's been unappreciative of your efforts to save the relationship. My husband had responded, perfect. Make sure you emphasize her refusal to contribute financially to the household and her increasing emotional instability. I have documentation of her erratic behavior, the storage unit incident being the most recent example. I screenshot everything, my hands trembling as I forwarded the images to my secure email account. But there was more. Another email thread, this one with James Clive, revealed the true scope of Richard's deception. The Westfield Heights property will transfer to the LLC as planned. With Nell having no knowledge of the business structure, she'll be entitled to half of the marital home's assessed value, approximately $400,000, while the actual property value through our investment vehicle is closer to $2.3 million. James had replied, And the Cayman accounts are completely off book from her perspective. She'll never know about the offshore investments. This was brilliant, Richard. Your wife thinks she's married to a mid-level banker when you're actually managing a portfolio worth more than most people see in a lifetime. My vision blurred as I continued reading. Richard and James, along with two other men from their firm, had created an elaborate network of LLCs, offshore accounts, and investment vehicles designed to hide assets from their wives. They called it their divorce insurance, a system that would ensure their spouses received only a fraction of their actual wealth in any future divorce proceedings. But the worst was yet to come. In an email dated just 2 days ago, Richard had written to his attorney, "I need this done before she starts asking questions. She's been behaving strangely since the storage unit situation, more assertive, asking about our finances, even questioning my decisions. I think she might be considering leaving me, which would be perfect timing. I'll look like the devoted husband trying to save his marriage from an ungrateful wife who abandoned him." The reply was chilling. The narrative is already established. We have documentation of her failure to contribute to household income, her expensive hobbies and shopping habits, and witnesses who can testify to her increasing emotional instability. When she's served tomorrow evening, she'll be so shocked and overwhelmed that she'll likely accept whatever settlement we offer just to make it go away quickly. I sat staring at the screen, my entire understanding of my marriage crumbling around me. Richard hadn't just been controlling my life, he'd been systematically planning my destruction while pretending to love me. Every kind gesture, every romantic dinner, every moment of apparent affection had been theater, performed while he documented my emotional instability, and hid millions of dollars from me. But there was something else in the emails that made my attorney instincts, inherited from years of listening to Anthony discuss legal strategy in college, start tingling with possibility. Richard had made a mistake, a big one. In his correspondence with his attorney, he detailed exactly how he'd hidden assets, named the offshore accounts, listed the properties held in LLCs, and even provided bank routing numbers for accounts in the Cayman Islands. He'd essentially created a detailed roadmap of his financial fraud, complete with co-conspirators and specific dollar amounts. More importantly, several emails revealed that this wasn't just about our marriage. Richard and his partners had been systematically defrauding their wives for years, moving marital assets into business entities their spouses knew nothing about. Anna Clive, Lizzie Arthur, and several other wives in their social circle were being stolen from by their own husbands. Anthony had been right, this was bigger than just my divorce. This was criminal fraud on a massive scale. I heard water running upstairs as Richard finished his shower. Quickly I forwarded every email to my secure account, then closed the laptop and tried to compose myself. When he came downstairs 15 minutes later, hair still damp, adjusting his cufflinks for our anniversary dinner, I was sitting at the kitchen island reading a magazine, looking like the oblivious wife he thought he'd married. "Ready for dinner, darling?" he asked, kissing my cheek with the same lips that had been planning my financial ruin for months. "Almost," I said, smiling the smile I'd perfected over 7 years of marriage. "Just let me grab my purse." As I walked upstairs to get ready, my phone buzzed with a text from Anthony. "How's the investigation going? Any new developments?" I typed back quickly, "Meet me tomorrow morning, early. I found something that changes everything." "Good news?" I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, seeing not the broken woman Richard thought he was married to, but someone who had just discovered she held all the cards in a game her husband didn't even know she was playing. "Better than good," I replied. "I found his playbook, all of it." That evening at dinner, Richard raised his glass of champagne in a toast to 10 wonderful years together. I clinked my glass against his and smiled, thinking about the divorce papers he planned to serve me tomorrow, and the criminal fraud charges he had no idea were coming his way. To many more years, I said sweetly, of getting exactly what we deserve. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. I met Anthony at his office at 7 in the morning, 3 hours before the divorce papers were scheduled to be served. His expression grew darker with each email I showed him on my laptop, and by the time I finished walking him through Richard's elaborate fraud scheme, he was pacing behind his desk like a caged predator. "This is unbelievable," he muttered, scrolling through the offshore account details. "I've seen hidden assets before, but nothing this systematic. They've been planning this for years." "What does it mean legally?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer would be life-changing. Anthony stopped pacing and looked at me directly. "It means your husband has committed multiple felonies: financial fraud, asset concealment, conspiracy to defraud, and not just against you but against every wife in their little investment club. This could result in serious prison time." He pulled out his phone and started making calls. First to his forensic accountant, then to a colleague who specialized in international asset recovery, then to someone he referred to only as my contact at the federal prosecutor's office. "We're going to need to move fast," he said, after finishing the calls. "If Richard suspects you know anything, he could transfer the offshore accounts or liquidate assets. We need to freeze everything before he serves you those papers." "How?" "Emergency court orders. Asset preservation injunctions. I can have papers filed within the hour requesting that all marital assets be frozen pending investigation of fraud." Anthony was already pulling files from his cabinet, moving with the efficiency of someone who had found their element. "But there's something else we need to discuss, Nell. This goes beyond just your divorce. What your husband and his friends have done. This is a criminal conspiracy that affects multiple families. The federal prosecutor is going to want to build a case." "What does that mean for me?" "It means you're not just a victim anymore. You're a witness. And if you're willing to cooperate with the investigation, you'll be in a position to ensure that Richard and his co-conspirators face real consequences for what they've done." I thought about Anna Clive, Lizzie Arthur, and the other wives who had no idea their husbands were systematically stealing from them. Women who, like me, had been kept ignorant of their own financial situations, while their spouses built elaborate schemes to defraud them. "I want to do it," I said. "All of it." Anthony smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since I'd walked into his office with my story of control and manipulation. "Then let's destroy them." The next 6 hours were a whirlwind of legal preparation. Anthony's team filed emergency motions with the court, requesting immediate asset freezes on all accounts associated with Richard's investment group. The forensic accountant worked with international authorities to trace the offshore accounts. A federal prosecutor was briefed on the conspiracy and began preparing search warrants for Richard's office and our home. But the most satisfying part was what Anthony called the trap. "Here's what's going to happen," he explained, showing me a timeline he'd sketched out. "Richard's attorney will serve you the divorce papers at your house this evening, expecting you to be shocked and devastated. You're going to let them believe they've succeeded. I don't understand. You're going to sign the papers. Accept the settlement they offer. Act like the broken, defeated wife they expect you to be." Anthony's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a chess player who had just seen checkmate in 3 moves. "Because while they're celebrating their victory, federal agents will be executing search warrants on all their properties. Bank accounts will be frozen. Asset recovery specialists will be seizing properties. And by tomorrow morning, Richard will discover that the woman he thought he'd destroyed is actually the one who destroyed him." That afternoon, I went home and played the role of the oblivious wife one last time. I arranged flowers, tidied the already immaculate house, and even put champagne in the refrigerator for our anniversary celebration. To anyone watching, I looked like a woman preparing for a romantic evening with her beloved husband. Richard came home at his usual time, carrying a bouquet of roses and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed he was about to win a game his opponent didn't even know they were playing. "Happy anniversary, darling," he said, kissing me with what I now recognized as performative affection. "I have a surprise for you tonight. I can't wait," I replied, thinking about the federal agents who were at that moment reviewing evidence of his crimes. During dinner, Richard was more attentive than he'd been in months, asking about my day, complimenting the meal I'd prepared, even suggesting we take a vacation together soon. It was the behavior of a man who believed he was about to be free of his wife, and wanted to maintain the pretense of being a devoted husband until the very end. At exactly 8:30, the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," Richard said, standing up with barely concealed excitement. He returned with his attorney, David Larkin, and James Clive, both men wearing expressions of smug sagwit that made my skin crawl. "Nell," Richard said, his voice taking on a tone of practiced regret, "David has some papers for us to review. Legal documents regarding our marriage." David placed a manila envelope on our dining room table. "Mrs. Donovan, these are divorce papers. Your husband has filed for dissolution of your marriage, citing irreconcilable differences, and your refusal to contribute to the household partnership." I stared at the envelope, letting my face show the shock and hurt they expected to see. "Richard, what is this?" "I'm sorry, Nell. I tried to make this work, but you've become increasingly difficult to live with. The storage unit incident was the final straw. I can't continue in a marriage with someone who's so emotionally unstable." James Clive stepped forward with his own folder. "We've prepared a generous settlement offer, Mrs. Donovan. Your husband wants to be fair, despite the circumstances." I opened the folder with trembling hands, not from fear, but from the effort of containing my rage. The settlement offered me exactly what they'd planned: half the assessed value of our house, $400,000, a small amount from Richard's known investment accounts, $150,000, and 3 years of alimony, $2,000 per month. Total $622,000 from a marriage to a man worth more than $8 million. "This seems like a lot," I said quietly, playing the part of the overwhelmed wife perfectly. "I don't know anything about finance. Maybe I should have a lawyer look at this." "That's not necessary," David Larkin said quickly. "This is a very generous offer, Mrs. Donovan. Most women in your situation would be grateful for this level of support from their ex-husband. If you sign tonight," Richard added, "we can make this as painless as possible. No drawn-out court battles, no public embarrassment, just a clean, quiet divorce, so we can both move on with our lives." I looked around the table at these 3 men, who thought they had successfully manipulated and defrauded me, and smiled the most genuine smile I'd worn in years. "You know what?" I said, picking up the pen. "You're absolutely right. I should be grateful." I signed every document they put in front of me, watching their faces light up with triumphant satisfaction. "Excellent," David said, gathering the papers. "We'll file these first thing in the morning." "Actually," I said, standing up from the table, "I have a surprise for you too." Before any of them could ask what I meant, the front door opened and Anthony walked in, followed by 6 federal agents wearing FBI windbreakers. "Richard Donovan," the lead agent announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and violation of federal banking laws." The look of shock on Richard's face as the handcuffs clicked into place was worth every moment of pain he'd put me through. "Nell," he whispered as they read him his rights, "what did you do?" I smiled and handed him a folder. Copies of every email he'd sent about hiding assets, every document detailing his offshore accounts, every piece of evidence he'd been stupid enough to put in writing. "I became exactly what you always said I was," I replied. "Ungrateful." 6 months later, I stood in the hallway outside courtroom 4B, watching through the small window as Richard sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit. His hair had grown longer in prison, and he'd lost weight. The polished investment banker I'd married was gone, replaced by someone who looked smaller, diminished, ordinary. Anthony stood beside me, reviewing his notes one final time. As the key witness in the federal prosecution, I'd spent months working with investigators, providing testimony, helping them trace the full scope of the conspiracy. What we'd uncovered was staggering. Over $50 million in hidden assets, 12 victims across 4 states, and a network of corruption that reached into some of the city's most prestigious financial institutions. "Are you ready for this?" Anthony asked, straightening his tie. He'd taken leave from his private practice to serve as a special prosecutor on the case, working directly with the federal team. "This is the big moment when you testify about discovering the emails." I nodded, though my stomach was churning with nervous energy. For 6 months, I'd been preparing for this moment. The moment when I'd face Richard in court, tell the world what he'd done, and watch him realize that the woman he'd tried to destroy had become the architect of his downfall. The courtroom was packed. Media representatives filled the back rows, drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Wealthy investment bankers systematically defrauding their wives through elaborate offshore schemes. But it was the front rows that caught my attention. Anna Clive, Lizzie Arthur, and 6 other women whose husbands were awaiting trial on similar charges. The wives Richard's conspiracy had stolen from, all of them now working together to ensure justice was served. The prosecution calls Nell Larkin Donovan to the stand. I walked through the courtroom, my heels clicking against the polished floor, feeling Richard's eyes on me but refusing to look in his direction. When I reached the witness stand and placed my hand on the Bible, I finally allowed myself to meet his gaze. The man who had once controlled every aspect of my life looked like he was seeing a ghost. "Mrs. Donovan," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court about the evening you discovered your husband's laptop open in your kitchen." I took a breath and began to speak, my voice steady and clear. I told them about the emails detailing the asset hiding scheme, about the offshore accounts, about the systematic way Richard and his co-conspirators had planned to defraud their wives while maintaining the facade of loving marriages. "What was your emotional state when you read these emails?" the prosecutor asked. "Devastated," I said honestly, "but also angry, not just for myself, but for every woman who had been betrayed by someone who claimed to love her." As I testified, I watched Richard's attorney, a different lawyer than David Larkin, who was now facing his own criminal charges, frantically taking notes. Richard himself sat motionless, his face a mask of controlled fury. The cross-examination was brutal. Richard's defense team tried to paint me as a vindictive ex-wife, someone who had fabricated evidence out of spite. They questioned my memory, my motives, even my mental stability, echoing the same emotional instability narrative Richard had planned to use in our divorce. But I was ready for them. Anthony had prepared me well. "Mrs. Donovan," the defense attorney said, "isn't it true that you were angry about your husband's success, that you felt entitled to money you hadn't earned?" I looked directly at Richard as I answered. "I was angry about being lied to for 10 years. I was angry about having my belongings hidden from me and nearly thrown away. I was angry about being kept ignorant of my own financial situation, while my husband stole from our marriage. But I was never angry about his success. I was proud of it, until I learned it was built on fraud." "But you had no direct knowledge of these alleged offshore accounts before finding the emails, correct? You're asking this court to believe that your husband successfully hid millions of dollars from you without your knowledge." "That's exactly what I'm asking the court to believe," I said, "because it's exactly what happened. My husband was very good at hiding things from me. He'd had 10 years of practice." When I stepped down from the witness stand, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the night I'd found those emails. Complete total vindication. I had told my story, presented the evidence, and watched 12 jurors listen with the kind of focused attention that suggested they understood the magnitude of what Richard had done. During the lunch recess, Anthony found me in the hallway outside the courtroom. "You were incredible in there," he said. "The jury was hanging on every word. Do you think they believe me?" "I think they believe the evidence, and the evidence is overwhelming." He paused, studying my face. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I expected," I said honestly. For so long, Richard made me feel like I was crazy, like my perceptions were wrong, like I couldn't trust my own judgment. Being able to stand up there and tell the truth, having people listen and believe me, it's incredibly healing. That afternoon, we heard from the forensic accountants who had traced the hidden assets, the federal agents who had executed the search warrants, and the international banking specialists who had helped recover funds from the Cayman Islands accounts. Piece by piece, they built an airtight case of deliberate, systematic fraud. But the most powerful moment came when Anna Clive took the stand. "I trusted my husband completely," she said, tears streaming down her face. "When he told me we couldn't afford our daughter's college tuition, I got a second job. When he said we needed to refinance our house, I signed whatever papers he put in front of me. I never knew that while I was working nights to make ends meet, he had millions of dollars hidden in accounts I'd never heard of." By the time the prosecution rested its case, Richard's defense team looked defeated. They tried to paint the conspiracy as a misunderstanding, a case of poor communication between spouses rather than deliberate fraud. But the evidence was too extensive, too detailed, too clearly intentional. On the final day of testimony, Richard himself took the stand against his attorney's advice, according to the whispered conversations I overheard in the hallway. He was polished, articulate, every inch the successful businessman I'd married. He talked about providing for his family, about making investment decisions he thought were in our best interest, about the pressures of managing significant wealth. "I never intended to hurt my wife," he said, looking directly at the jury. "Everything I did was to protect our financial future." But during cross-examination, the prosecutor systematically dismantled his story. "Mr. Donovan, you sent an email to your attorney stating, and I quote, 'She'll never know about the offshore investments.' Does that sound like someone trying to protect his wife's financial future?" Richard's composure cracked slightly. "That was taken out of context." "What context makes hiding $8 million from your spouse acceptable, Mr. Donovan?" "I was protecting those assets from your wife." "You were protecting those assets from your wife, who was legally entitled to know about them." By the time Richard stepped down from the witness stand, he looked like a man who knew he'd lost everything. That evening, as we waited for the jury to deliberate, I sat in Anthony's office, looking out at the city lights. Tomorrow, I would learn Richard's fate. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt like myself again. The woman who had been systematically erased was not only back, she was stronger than she'd ever been before. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When we filed back into the courtroom, I could see the answer in their faces before the foreman even stood up. Richard must have seen it too, because his shoulders sagged in defeat. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of violation of federal banking laws, we find the defendant guilty. Guilty, on all counts. The words echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Richard closed his eyes as the judge read the verdict, his hands folded in his lap. When he opened them again, he looked directly at me. For a moment, I saw not the controlling man who had systematically erased my identity, but someone who finally understood that his actions had consequences he couldn't manipulate or avoid. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks later, but everyone in the courtroom knew Richard was facing a minimum of 15 years in federal prison. His co-conspirators, James Clive, David Larkin, and 4 other men from their investment firm, had already accepted plea deals in exchange for their testimony against him. As the ringleader of the conspiracy, Richard would receive the harshest sentence. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, Richard turned back one more time. "Nell," he called out, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing but pity. This man who had once seemed so powerful, so in control of everything around him, was just someone who had been so terrified of losing what he had that he'd destroyed everything that actually mattered. "I know you are," I said quietly, "but sorry doesn't give me back the 10 years you stole from me." Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me with cameras and microphones. Anthony stepped protectively beside me as I faced the media for the first time since the story had broken. "Mrs. Donovan, how does it feel to see your ex-husband convicted? What message do you have for other women who might be in similar situations? Do you feel vindicated?" I looked directly into the cameras, thinking about all the women who might be watching, who might be living in beautiful cages of their own, who might be slowly disappearing into someone else's vision of who they should be. "I feel grateful," I said. "Grateful that I found the courage to trust my instincts, grateful for the people who helped me find the truth, and grateful that justice was served not just for me, but for every woman whose husband betrayed her trust in the most fundamental way possible." "What's next for you?" a reporter called out. I smiled, the first completely genuine, unguarded smile I'd worn in public in years. "I'm going to paint," I said. "I have a solo exhibition opening next month at the Morrison Gallery. My first show in over 10 years. The same gallery that had offered me a show before I met Richard, the letter he'd hidden from me. When I'd contacted them with my story, they'd been more than eager to finally give me the platform he'd stolen. The exhibition is called Storm Breaking," I continued. "It's about finding yourself after you thought you were lost forever." As we walked away from the courthouse, Anthony smiled at me. "So what now? Back to being Nell Larkin, artist extraordinaire." "Actually," I said, "I think I'll keep the name Nell Donovan. It belongs to the woman who was strong enough to bring down a criminal conspiracy. That woman deserves to be remembered." That evening, I sat in my new apartment, a loft with huge windows and northern light, perfect for painting. Surrounded by canvases I'd completed over the past 6 months. They were unlike anything I'd painted before, bold, emotional, unapologetically honest. The work of someone who had stopped asking permission to take up space in the world. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Saw the news. I'm so proud of you. The Nell I knew in college would be amazed by who you've become." I looked around my studio, at the paintings that would soon hang in a gallery, at the life I'd built from the ashes of my marriage, and realized something profound. The Nell from college would be amazed. But she'd also be proud. Because I hadn't just survived Richard's attempt to erase me. I'd become more myself than I'd ever been before. 2 years later, I stood in the Morrison Gallery surrounded by red dots, the small stickers that indicated sold paintings. My second solo exhibition, Reconstructed, was nearly sold out on opening night. "Nell," Patricia appeared at my elbow, champagne glass in hand, beaming with pride. "The critic from Art Review just bought 3 pieces. She said your work has fearless emotional authenticity." I laughed, remembering how those same words, emotional authenticity, had once been used by Richard to criticize my art as chaotic and unsophisticated. Now they were being celebrated in art magazines and newspaper reviews. "How does it feel to be vindicated?" Patricia asked, echoing the reporter's question from 2 years ago. It feels like coming home, I said, watching people move through the gallery, stopping to study my paintings with the kind of serious attention I dreamed of receiving when I was 26 and struggling to pay rent. The money from Richard's conviction had been substantial, not just my share of our hidden assets, but the federal government's reward for exposing the conspiracy, plus a settlement from his investment firm. I was by any measure wealthy, but more importantly, I was free. Free to paint what I wanted, when I wanted, how I wanted. Free to take up space without apologizing for it. Free to trust my own judgment without second-guessing every decision. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," Anthony said, appearing beside us with a woman I didn't recognize. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen. She runs a foundation that helps women escape financial abuse." Dr. Chen shook my hand warmly. "I've been following your story since the trial. What you did, the courage it took to investigate your own husband, to gather evidence, to testify. It's inspired so many women to examine their own situations." "I wasn't trying to be inspirational," I said honestly. "I was just trying to survive." "That's exactly what makes it so powerful," she replied. "You showed women that they don't have to accept being diminished, that they can fight back, even against people who seem to hold all the power." She handed me a business card. "We're launching a program to help women identify financial abuse and develop exit strategies. Would you consider speaking at our inaugural conference? Your story could save lives." I looked at the card, thinking about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, isolated, confused, convinced that her perceptions couldn't be trusted. If my story could help even one woman recognize the signs earlier than I had, it would be worth the vulnerability of sharing it. "I'd be honored," I said. Later that evening, after the gallery had emptied and the red dots had been counted, I walked home through the city streets. My loft was only 6 blocks from the gallery, in a neighborhood Richard would have called too bohemian for someone of our social standing. But it was my neighborhood now, filled with artists and writers and people who valued creativity over conformity. My phone buzzed with a text from Anna Clive. "Saw the review in the Times. So proud of you. James got 18 months, served 9, out on probation now. Working at his brother's accounting firm in Nebraska. Karma is real." I smiled, thinking about the network of women we'd formed during the trial. Anna, Lizzie and I met for dinner once a month, along with several other wives who'd been victims of the conspiracy. We called ourselves the Phoenix Club, women who'd risen from the ashes of our demolished marriages, stronger than we'd been before. In my studio that night, I stood before my easel, working on a new piece. This one wasn't part of any exhibition, it was just for me. A self-portrait, but not the kind I would have painted 10 years ago. This woman looked directly at the viewer, unafraid, unapologetic. Her eyes held wisdom earned through pain, strength built through survival. I'd titled it "Storm Survived." As I painted, I thought about the letter Richard had sent from prison 6 months ago. 3 pages of apologies and explanations, asking for my forgiveness, promising he'd learned from his mistakes. I'd read it once and thrown it away. Forgiveness wasn't something he could ask for and receive like a transaction. It was something I might choose to give, someday, for my own peace. But it wouldn't change what he'd done or restore what he'd stolen. What mattered now was what I'd built from the wreckage. The art that was selling in galleries. The foundation work that was helping other women, the life that was completely authentically mine. The woman who had once disappeared into someone else's vision of perfection, had been reborn as someone who refused to be anything other than exactly who she was. And she was magnificent.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.